Every morning at 7:45 a.m., Rosa walked into Lincoln High School's music room with her head down and books clutched tight against her chest. She always chose the same seat, back row, corner spot, right next to the window where she could watch the world outside if things got too overwhelming inside. Mrs. Patterson, the music teacher, had taught at Lincoln for 15 years. She knew every student's name, their parents' jobs, and usually their musical abilities within the first week of school. But Rosa, she was different. Quiet as a mouse, never raised her hand, never volunteered for anything. Mrs. Patterson barely noticed her at all. What Mrs. Patterson didn't know was that Rosa heard everything. Every chord progression, every music theory lesson, every mistake other students made. Rosa absorbed it all like a sponge soaking up water. While her classmates struggled to understand the difference between major and minor scales, Rosa was already thinking 3 lessons ahead. Rosa's life outside school was nothing like her wealthy classmates. Her mom, Carmen, worked as a cleaning lady at 3 different office buildings. Every morning at 4 a.m., Carmen would kiss Rosa goodbye and head off to her first job. Rosa would get herself ready for school, make a simple breakfast, and walk the 2 miles to Lincoln High because the bus cost money they didn't have. Their apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen and a living room that doubled as Rosa's study space. But in the corner of that living room sat something magical, an old upright piano that Carmen had bought at a yard sale for $50. The piano was far from perfect. 3 keys didn't work at all, the bench wobbled, and it hadn't been tuned in years. But to Rosa, it was everything. Rosa had started playing when she was 8 years old. No lessons, no teacher, no fancy music books. She just sat down and began pressing keys, listening to the sounds they made. At first, it was just noise, but slowly, over months and years, the noise became music. She learned by watching YouTube videos on the old laptop her mom had gotten from her cleaning job when the office was throwing it away. Rosa would watch the same video dozens of times, pausing and rewinding, watching fingers move across keys until she could copy the movements perfectly. Her neighbors never complained about the piano, even though the walls were thin. Maybe it was because Rosa only played when she thought no one was listening. Or maybe it was because even on that broken old piano, Rosa made beautiful music. At school, Rosa's test scores in music class were always perfect. She understood concepts that confused students who had been taking private lessons for years. But she never spoke up, never showed off, never let anyone know just how much music lived inside her head. During lunch, while other students ate in the cafeteria, Rosa would slip into the music room. Mrs. Patterson usually left for the teacher's lounge, and Rosa would have the room's grand piano all to herself. She would run her fingers over the keys. All of them worked perfectly, and the sound was rich and clear, nothing like her piano at home. Those lunch periods became Rosa's secret concerts. She would play pieces she had learned from YouTube, but she would also play her own creations, melodies that came to her in the middle of the night, rhythms she heard in the sound of rain on the window, harmonies that matched the way she felt when she watched the sunrise. One day, Mrs. Patterson came back early from lunch. She heard music coming from her classroom. Not the stumbling, hesitant playing of a student practicing, but something beautiful and complex. She crept to the door and peeked inside. There was Rosa, the quiet girl from the back row, playing music that made Mrs. Patterson's heart skip. Her fingers moved across the keys with confidence and grace. Her eyes were closed, and she swayed slightly with the rhythm. This wasn't someone playing notes on a page. This was someone speaking fluent music. Mrs. Patterson watched for several minutes, afraid to interrupt. When Rosa finished playing, she opened her eyes and saw her teacher standing there. Her face turned red and she quickly gathered her books. "Rosa, wait," Mrs. Patterson called out. But Rosa was already gone, practically running out of the room. From that day forward, Mrs. Patterson paid closer attention to the quiet girl in the back row. She noticed how Rosa's eyes lit up during complex lessons. She saw how Rosa's fingers would move slightly, as if playing invisible piano keys when they discussed different pieces. But Rosa had built walls around her musical world. She was afraid that if people knew how much she loved music, they might take it away somehow. She was afraid they might laugh at her broken piano or her YouTube education. She was afraid of standing out in a world where she had learned that being invisible was safer. What Rosa didn't know was that her music was about to take her on a journey that would change everything. The quiet girl who sat in the back row was about to step into the spotlight, whether she was ready or not. The seed of something extraordinary was growing inside Rosa's small apartment. In those stolen lunch periods, in every note she played on her broken piano, soon the whole world would hear what Mrs. Patterson had discovered that day. Rosa wasn't just a student who loved music. She was a musician who happened to be in school. Every evening, Rosa would come home to find her mom exhausted from her long day of work. Carmen would ask about school, and Rosa would give the same answer. It was fine, Mom. She never mentioned the music, never talked about the piano in the classroom, never shared the melodies that filled her dreams. But Carmen knew her daughter was special. She heard the piano playing late at night, soft and careful, beautiful enough to make her stop whatever she was doing and just listen. She didn't have money for piano lessons or fancy music schools, but she had given Rosa the one thing that mattered most, the piano itself, and the freedom to discover music on her own terms. As Rosa drifted off to sleep each night, her fingers would still be moving, playing silent songs on her blanket. In her dreams, she performed on grand stages for thousands of people. But when morning came, she would wake up, get dressed, and walk to school to take her place in the back row, invisible once again. Little did she know that her invisibility was about to end forever. Spring arrived at Lincoln High School with an announcement that would change Rosa's life forever. Mrs. Patterson stood at the front of the music classroom, holding a bright blue flyer that seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. "The Berklee Music Institute is offering a full scholarship," she announced to the class. "This covers everything: tuition, room, board, even books. But here's the catch. They're only giving one scholarship this year, and students from across the entire country will be competing for it." Rosa's classmates immediately started chattering excitedly. Jessica, who had been taking piano lessons since she was 4, raised her hand. "Mrs. Patterson, what do we need to do to apply?" "Well," Mrs. Patterson said, glancing around the room, "you need to submit a video audition first. If they like what they see, you'll be invited to Boston for a live audition in front of their faculty panel." Rosa felt her stomach flip. Boston might as well have been on another planet. She had never been outside their small town, never even stayed in a hotel. But something deep inside her whispered that this was important, that this mattered. After class, Rosa lingered behind while other students rushed out to lunch. Mrs. Patterson was erasing the board when she noticed Rosa still sitting there. "Rosa, did you have a question about the assignment?" Rosa took a deep breath. "The scholarship. Do you think... would it be okay if I tried?" Mrs. Patterson stopped erasing and turned around. Ever since that day she had caught Rosa playing during lunch, she had been watching her more carefully. She had seen the way Rosa's face changed during music lessons, the way her eyes sparkled when they discussed complex compositions. "Rosa, I think you should definitely apply," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "In fact, I think you might surprise yourself." That evening, Rosa sat at her kitchen table with the application printed on cheap paper from the school library. The question seemed overwhelming. List your musical experience. Describe your training. Name your accomplishments and awards. Rosa stared at the blank spaces. What could she write? That she had learned piano from YouTube? That her only stage was her own living room? That she had never performed for anyone except her sleeping mother? Carmen came home from her second job at 9 p.m., her feet aching and her uniform wrinkled. She found Rosa hunched over the papers, a pencil in her hand, but nothing written down. "Mija, what's all this?" Carmen asked, settling into the chair next to her daughter. Rosa explained about the scholarship, about Berklee, about the chance to study music seriously. As she talked, her voice grew stronger, more excited. Carmen listened with growing amazement. She had no idea Rosa wanted this so badly. "The thing is, Mom," Rosa said, her voice getting smaller again, "I don't think I'm good enough. Look at these questions. They want to know about awards and competitions and formal training. I don't have any of that." Carmen was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked to the old piano. She touched the keys gently, the same keys Rosa had been playing for years. "Rosa, come here and play something for me. Play what you played last night when you thought I was asleep." Rosa's cheeks turned red. "You heard that? Mija, I hear everything you play, and every single time it makes my day better. It makes all the hard work worth it." Carmen sat down on the wobbly bench and patted the space next to her. "Play for me now." Rosa sat down and placed her hands on the familiar keys. She closed her eyes and let the music flow out of her. A piece she had created herself, born from the feeling of watching her mother come home tired every night, mixed with the hope of something better waiting in the future. When she finished, Carmen had tears in her eyes. "Rosa, that was beautiful. More beautiful than anything I've ever heard on the radio or TV. You think those other kids can do that? Make up music from their hearts?" The next week, Rosa spent every lunch period in the music room, not hiding anymore, but working with Mrs. Patterson to prepare her audition video. They chose 3 pieces: one classical piece she had learned from YouTube, one jazz standard she had taught herself, and one original composition. Mrs. Patterson had never heard Rosa's original music before. When Rosa played her own composition, Mrs. Patterson had to sit down. This wasn't just a student playing piano. This was a young artist expressing something deep and real and completely unique. "Rosa," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, "how long have you been composing your own music?" "I don't know if you'd call it composing," Rosa said, embarrassed. "I just play what I feel, I guess." "That's exactly what composing is," Mrs. Patterson replied, "and you're incredibly good at it." They recorded the video on a Tuesday afternoon after school. Rosa wore her best dress, a simple blue one her mom had bought at a thrift store for church. Her hands shook a little as she began the first piece, but by the second measure she forgot about the camera entirely. For 15 minutes, Rosa played her heart out on that school piano. The classical piece showcased her technical skills. The jazz piece showed her understanding of different musical styles. But the original composition, that showed who Rosa really was as a musician. When they finished recording, Mrs. Patterson helped Rosa upload the video and submit her application. As they hit the send button, Rosa felt like she was jumping off a cliff. There was no going back now. 3 weeks later, Rosa was walking home from school when she saw Carmen waiting on their front steps, holding an envelope with a Berklee Music Institute return address. "It came today," Carmen said, her voice shaking. "I didn't want to open it without you." Rosa's hands trembled as she tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter with the Berklee logo at the top. She read the first line once, then twice, then a third time before the words sank in. "Congratulations, Rosa. You have been selected as a finalist for the Berklee Music Institute Full Scholarship. You are invited to audition in person on April 15th in Boston, Massachusetts." Rosa and Carmen looked at each other, then started screaming and hugging and crying all at the same time. Their neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, came out to see what was happening, and soon half the apartment building was celebrating with them. That night, as Rosa lay in bed, she could hardly believe it was real. In 3 weeks, she would be in Boston, auditioning at one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. The quiet girl from the back row was about to step into a much bigger world. But first, she had to figure out how to get to Boston. The letter said travel expenses weren't covered, and Rosa's family barely had enough money for groceries, let alone plane tickets and hotel rooms. Carmen had already thought of that. The next morning, she announced that she was picking up extra cleaning shifts. Mrs. Rodriguez offered to help with gas money. The church took up a small collection. Even Mrs. Patterson contributed money from her own pocket. Rosa was overwhelmed by how many people wanted to help her succeed. She had spent so long being invisible that she had forgotten how good it felt to be seen, to be supported, to be believed in. The money came together slowly, dollar by dollar, but it came together. Rosa was going to Boston. She was going to audition, and whatever happened next, she would know she had tried for something bigger than her small town, bigger than her broken piano, bigger than the quiet girl she had always been. Rosa had never seen a building like the Berklee Music Institute. Glass and steel reached toward the sky, and every window seemed to gleam in the Boston sunshine. Students walked by carrying expensive instrument cases, talking confidently about composers Rosa had only read about online. She and Carmen had taken a bus from their hometown, 14 hours of stopping and starting, sleeping sitting up, sharing snacks they had packed in a paper bag. When they finally arrived in Boston, Rosa felt like she had landed on a different planet. Their hotel room was tiny and smelled like old cigarettes, but it was the first hotel Rosa had ever stayed in. Carmen had found the cheapest place she could, and they would share the single bed to save money. But Rosa was too nervous to care about comfort. "Tomorrow is the big day, mija," Carmen said as they got ready for bed. Are you scared? Rosa nodded. What if I don't belong here, Mom? What if everyone else is so much better than me? Carmen sat on the edge of the bed and took Rosa's hands. Listen to me. You belong anywhere your talent can take you. Don't let anyone make you feel small. The next morning, Rosa put on her blue dress again, the same one from her video audition. She had wanted to buy something new, but there wasn't money for that. As they walked into the Berkeley building, Rosa immediately felt underdressed. The waiting area was filled with about 30 other students, and Rosa had never seen anything like it. A girl about her age was warming up on a practice piano, playing a piece so complex that Rosa's head spun just listening to it. The girl's dress probably cost more than Rosa's family spent on groceries in a month. A boy near the window was stretching his fingers before sitting down at another practice piano. He launched into a piece that Rosa recognized from YouTube, one of the hardest classical compositions ever written. He played it like it was as easy as breathing. Rosa looked around at the other students. Designer clothes, expensive jewelry, confident postures. They talked about their private teachers, their competition wins, their performances with youth orchestras. One girl mentioned flying in from California just for this audition. Another boy casually mentioned that his parents had both graduated from Berkeley. Rosa clutched her simple folder containing 3 pieces of sheet music, all she could afford to print at the library back home. She suddenly felt like everyone could see right through her, could tell she didn't belong in this world of privilege and professional training. So where are you from? Asked a girl with perfectly styled hair who had sat down next to Rosa. A small town about 6 hours from here, Rosa replied quietly. Oh, how interesting. And who do you study with there? Rosa's cheeks burned. I'm mostly self-taught. The girl's eyebrows shot up. Self-taught? Wow, that's unique. I've been with the same teacher since I was 5. She studied at Juilliard. Where did you do your competition circuit? I haven't really done competitions, Rosa admitted. The conversation died there. The girl turned away to talk to another student about their mutual acquaintance from summer music camp, a camp that cost more than Rosa's mom made in 3 months, Rosa excused herself and found a bathroom where she could be alone for a minute. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her simple dress, her hair that she had styled herself, her hands that showed she wasn't afraid of hard work. What am I doing here? She whispered to her reflection. She thought about leaving. She could tell Carmen they should go home, that this was all a mistake. She could go back to her quiet life, her back row seat, her broken piano that only she could hear. But then she remembered something Mrs. Patterson had told her. Rosa, talent isn't about where you come from or how much money your family has. Talent is about what lives inside you and how you share it with the world. Rosa splashed cold water on her face, straightened her dress, and walked back to the waiting area with her head held higher. She found an empty practice room and sat down at the piano inside. For a moment she just sat there, letting her hands rest on the keys. Then she began to play, not one of her prepared pieces, but something that came from her heart. A melody that spoke about feeling small in a big world, about dreams that seemed impossible, about the courage it takes to try anyway. As she played, Rosa felt herself settling back into who she really was. Not the girl who was intimidated by expensive clothes and fancy teachers, but the musician who could speak truth through piano keys. When she finished playing, she realized someone was standing outside the practice room door. It was an older man with kind eyes and graying hair. He was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, nothing fancy or intimidating. "Excuse me," he said gently. "I don't think that was one of the standard audition pieces." "Was that your own composition?" Rosa nodded, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I know I should be practicing my prepared pieces. I just needed to center yourself," the man finished with a smile. "I completely understand. I'm Professor Williams, and I'll be on your audition panel today." That was beautiful, by the way. Very honest. Rosa's eyes widened. This was one of the famous professors she had read about online. One of the most respected pianists in the country, and he was talking to her like she mattered. "Don't let the atmosphere here psych you out," Professor Williams said quietly. "Yes, many of these students have had advantages you probably haven't had. But you know what I've learned in 20 years of teaching? Technical perfection is common. Real musicianship, the ability to say something meaningful through your instrument, that's rare. And from what I just heard, you have something very special." He walked away, leaving Rosa sitting at the piano with tears in her eyes. Not tears of sadness or fear anymore, but tears of hope. When Rosa returned to the waiting area, she saw the other students differently. Yes, they had advantages she didn't have. Yes, they had been trained by expensive teachers and performed on prestigious stages. But Professor Williams was right. They were all technically perfect in similar ways. Rosa had something different. She had learned music because she loved it, not because her parents had signed her up for lessons. She had developed her own voice because she had to, not because a teacher had told her how to sound. She had composed music because she had feelings that could only be expressed through melody and harmony. A woman with a clipboard called Rosa's name. Rosa Hernandez? "You're next." Rosa stood up, smoothed down her blue dress, and picked up her simple folder. As she walked toward the audition room, she heard two students behind her whispering. "Self-taught? This should be interesting," one of them said with a smirk. Rosa turned around and looked at them directly. "It will be," she said with quiet confidence. The audition room was intimidating. A massive space with a concert grand piano in the center and 5 professors sitting at a table nearby. But Rosa had played in intimidating spaces before. Her own living room when she was afraid of waking her mother. The school music room when she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be there. As she walked to the piano, Rosa thought about her mom, probably sitting in their hotel room right now, praying for her daughter's success. She thought about Mrs. Patterson, who had believed in her when no one else did. She thought about the broken piano at home that had taught her to make beauty out of imperfection. Rosa sat down at the bench and placed her hands on the keys. The piano was perfectly tuned, perfectly maintained, perfectly balanced. For a moment it felt strange after years of playing her imperfect instrument at home. But then she pressed the first key, and the sound that came out was pure and clear and full of possibility. Rosa smiled. This was where she belonged. Not because of her clothes or her training or her background, but because music lived in her bones and she was ready to let it out. Professor David Chen had been listening to auditions all day, and frankly, he was getting tired. Not physically tired, mentally tired. For 6 hours he had heard technically perfect performances of the same classical pieces over and over again. Each student played beautifully, but they all sounded remarkably similar. Perfect scales. Perfect timing. Perfect technique. But where was the heart? Where was the individual voice that made music meaningful rather than just accurate? As the afternoon wore on, Professor Chen found himself thinking about why he had become a musician in the first place. It wasn't because he wanted to play other people's music perfectly. It was because music had given him a way to express feelings he couldn't put into words, thoughts he couldn't explain any other way. When Rosa walked into the audition room, Professor Chen noticed several things immediately. Her dress was simple and clearly not expensive, but it was clean and pressed with care. Her posture was nervous but determined. Most importantly, when she looked at the piano, her entire face changed, like she was greeting an old friend. "Good afternoon, Rosa," Professor Chen said warmly. "We've reviewed your audition video and we were very impressed. Are you ready to play your prepared pieces for us today?" Rosa nodded and opened her folder. She had practiced these 3 pieces hundreds of times. The classical sonata that showcased her technical skills, the jazz standard that showed her versatility, the original composition that revealed her creative side. But as Rosa placed her sheet music on the piano stand, Professor Chen made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "Actually, Rosa, let's try something different today." Rosa looked up, confused. She had prepared for months. She had memorized every note, practiced every difficult passage until her fingers could play it perfectly, even when she was half asleep. Professor Chen stood up from the panel table and walked over to the piano. Rosa moved aside, watching as he sat down at the bench. His hands hovered over the keys for a moment. Then he pressed one single key, middle C. The note rang out clear and pure in the silent room. He let the note fade completely before turning to Rosa. "I want you to respond to that," he said simply. "Just respond to what you heard." Rosa stared at him. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Do you want me to play a scale starting with C, or a C major chord?" Professor Chen smiled. "No specific requirements. Just sit down at the piano and respond to that note however it makes you feel. Show me what that sound means to you." The other professors at the table exchanged glances. This wasn't part of their standard audition process. They had a schedule to keep, specific pieces to evaluate, technical skills to assess. But Professor Chen was the senior faculty member, and his unconventional methods had discovered some of their most successful students over the years. Rosa looked at the piano, then back at Professor Chen. But what if I play the wrong thing? Rosa, Professor Chen said gently, there is no wrong thing. Music isn't about right and wrong. It's about truth and expression. I just played one note and it created a feeling in this room. What feeling did it create for you? Rosa sat down at the bench slowly. Her prepared pieces suddenly seemed meaningless. All those months of practice, and now she was being asked to do something completely different, something she had never prepared for. She placed her hands on the keys and thought about that single note. Middle C. In music theory, it was called the center note, the reference point from which all other notes were measured. It wasn't high or low, happy or sad by itself. It just was. But as Rosa thought about it more, she realized that middle C reminded her of something. It reminded her of home. Not because it was a comfortable sound, but because it was a starting place, like sitting at her broken piano at the beginning of each practice session, finding her center before letting the music take her wherever it wanted to go. Take your time, Professor Chen said. There's no rush. Rosa closed her eyes and pressed middle C again, just as Professor Chen had done. She let the note ring out, feeling its vibrations through the piano bench, through the floor, through her bones. When the sound faded, Rosa found herself thinking about her journey to this moment. She thought about the first time she had touched piano keys as an 8-year-old, not knowing what sounds would come out. She thought about learning to work around the broken keys on her piano at home, making music despite imperfection. She thought about playing in the empty music room at school, the way those stolen lunch periods had felt like stealing time itself. She thought about the YouTube videos she had watched over and over, learning not just the notes but the emotions behind them. Most of all, she thought about why she played music at all. Not for competitions or recognition or scholarships, but because music was the only language that let her say things she couldn't say with words. Rosa opened her eyes and began to play. She started with that same middle C, letting it establish itself as home base. Then she began to explore around it, first tentatively, like a person stepping into unknown territory, then with growing confidence as she found her footing. The melody that emerged was unlike anything Rosa had ever played before. It wasn't from sheet music or YouTube videos or any composition she had studied. It was purely her own response to this moment, to this opportunity, to this room full of people who were listening to her with complete attention. As her hands moved across the keys, Rosa forgot about the audition entirely. She forgot about the other students in the waiting room with their expensive clothes and private teachers. She forgot about the scholarship and the competition and the pressure to impress. She remembered why she loved music. The piece she created began with that sense of home, that middle C foundation. But then it grew into something larger, a musical story about dreams that seemed impossible, about taking chances that scared you, about finding your voice in a world that often tried to make you invisible. Professor Chen leaned back in his chair and listened with growing amazement. In 25 years of teaching, he had heard thousands of auditions. He had listened to students play the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire with flawless technique. But what Rosa was doing right now was something different entirely. She wasn't just playing music. She was creating it in real time, letting her emotions and experiences flow through her fingers onto the keys. This wasn't performance, it was pure musical communication. The other professors stopped taking notes and just listened. Even the administrative assistant, who had been quietly organizing paperwork at the back of the room, put down her pen and gave Rosa her full attention. For 8 minutes, Rosa played a conversation between herself and that single note Professor Chen had given her. Sometimes the music was questioning, as if she was asking the note what it wanted from her. Sometimes it was confident, as if she had found the answer and was sharing it boldly. Sometimes it was gentle and introspective, like a private conversation with an old friend. As Rosa played, she felt something she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, she wasn't trying to prove she belonged somewhere. She wasn't trying to copy someone else or play something the right way. She was simply being herself, completely and honestly through music. The last notes of her improvised piece faded into silence. Rosa sat at the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys, breathing hard as if she had just finished running a race. The room remained completely quiet. Rosa began to panic. Had she completely misunderstood the assignment? Had she just ruined her only chance at this scholarship by ignoring her prepared pieces and playing something weird and random instead? She turned to look at Professor Chen, afraid of what she might see in his expression. But his face wasn't disappointed or confused. Instead, he was looking at her with something that might have been wonder. Rosa's hands trembled slightly as they rested on the piano keys. The silence in the audition room felt heavy, like the moment between lightning and thunder when you're holding your breath waiting for the sound to hit. What had she just done? Professor Chen had asked for a simple response to one note, and instead she had played for 8 straight minutes, pouring her entire life story into an improvised piece that had never existed before and would never exist again in exactly the same way. She could feel the 5 professors staring at her, but she couldn't bring herself to turn around and face their expressions. Were they confused? Annoyed that she had wasted their time? Disappointed that she hadn't played the classical pieces they were expecting to hear? The silence stretched on. Rosa began to wonder if she should apologize, if she should ask to start over with her prepared pieces. Maybe she could salvage this audition if she showed them she could follow directions and play traditional music like everyone else. But as those thoughts raced through her mind, Rosa realized something important. For the first time in her musical life, she had played with complete honesty. Every note had come from a real place inside her. She hadn't been trying to impress anyone or prove anything. She had simply been sharing who she was through the language she spoke most fluently: music. That middle C that Professor Chen had played had unlocked something in Rosa that she didn't even know was there. When she heard that note, it didn't just sound like a pitch. It sounded like possibility. It sounded like a door opening, like an invitation to step into a bigger version of herself. Rosa's response had started with that same middle C, but then it had grown into something much more complex. She had woven together musical influences from her entire life, the classical pieces she had learned from YouTube, the jazz standards she had discovered on late-night radio, the Latin rhythms her mother hummed while cooking dinner. But more than that, she had let the music tell her own story. The tentative opening notes had captured the feeling of being the quiet girl in the back row, afraid to be noticed. As the piece developed, the music had grown bolder, more confident, like Rosa finding her voice for the first time. She had played through the loneliness of practicing on a broken piano while her mother worked long hours. She had played through the frustration of wanting to learn but not having money for lessons. She had played through the hope that had carried her all the way to Boston, sitting in this room with these accomplished professors. The middle section of her improvisation had been the most complex part. Her left hand had played steady, grounding rhythms while her right hand had soared into melodies that seemed to reach for something just beyond her grasp. It was musical storytelling about dreaming bigger than your circumstances, about believing in possibilities that other people couldn't see. As the piece had moved toward its conclusion, Rosa had brought the music back to that original middle C, but it sounded different now. It wasn't just a starting point anymore. It was home base after a long journey. It was the same note, but Rosa had changed through the process of exploring around it, and so the note itself had somehow changed too. The final chord had been simple but powerful, middle C with harmonies built around it, like a house with strong foundations. It had felt like Rosa was saying, "This is who I am, this is where I come from, and this is what I have to offer." Now, sitting in the aftermath of that musical confession, Rosa wasn't sure if she had just created something beautiful or made a terrible mistake. Professor Chen was the first to break the silence. "Rosa," he said quietly, "have you ever written that down?" Rosa turned around to face him, confusion written across her face. "Written what down?" "What you just played. Have you ever notated it?" No, sir. I mean, I've never played it before. It just happened." Professor Chen exchanged glances with the other faculty members. Professor Martinez, who taught composition, was leaning forward in her chair, her eyes wide with interest. Professor Johnson, the jazz studies director, was nodding slowly, as if he had just witnessed something remarkable. "Rosa," Professor Chen continued, "what you just did is called improvisation, but calling it improvisation almost seems too simple for what we just heard. You created a complete musical narrative in real time. You took one note and built an entire emotional journey around it. Rosa's cheeks flushed. I'm sorry if it wasn't what you wanted. I can play my prepared pieces now if you'd like. Oh, we definitely want to hear your prepared pieces, said Professor Martinez. But first I have to ask, how long have you been composing? Composing? Rosa repeated. I don't really compose. I just play what I feel sometimes. Professor Johnson laughed, but it was a warm laugh, full of delight rather than mockery. Rosa, that's exactly what composing is. And what you just did shows a level of musical intuition that most of our students don't develop until their junior or senior year. Professor Chen stood up and walked back to the piano. Rosa, I've been teaching here for 25 years. I've heard thousands of auditions. Students play Bach and Chopin and Mozart beautifully, technically perfect, musically sophisticated. But do you know what I rarely hear? Rosa shook her head. I rarely hear someone speak their own musical language fluently. Most young musicians are so focused on learning to speak other composers' languages that they never develop their own voice. You've somehow done the opposite. You've developed your own voice so strongly that when I gave you complete freedom, you used it to say something completely original and completely true. Rosa felt tears starting to form in her eyes. But I don't have the training that the other students have. I've never studied composition formally. I learned most of what I know from YouTube videos. Professor Martinez smiled. Rosa, some of the most important musicians in history were largely self-taught. What matters isn't how you learned, it's what you learned, and more importantly, what you have to say through your music. The thing is, added Professor Johnson, formal training can sometimes interfere with natural musical instincts. It sounds like you've developed your ear and your creative instincts without anyone telling you what you're supposed to do. That's actually a tremendous advantage. Professor Chen returned to his seat at the panel table. Rosa, I'd like you to play your prepared pieces now, but I want you to know that what you just shared with us has already shown us more about your potential as a musician than any prepared piece could. Rosa nodded and turned back to the piano. She opened her folder and placed the sheet music for her first piece, a Bach invention, on the music stand. But as she looked at the notes on the page, they seemed different somehow. They weren't just technical exercises anymore. They were another composer's way of expressing musical ideas, just like she had been expressing her own ideas a few minutes earlier. As Rosa began to play the Bach piece, something remarkable happened. Her technical execution was flawless. Her months of practice had paid off. But more than that, she played with a musicality and understanding that surprised even her. She wasn't just playing the notes Bach had written. She was having a conversation with Bach across centuries, understanding what he had been trying to say and adding her own voice to the dialogue. The professors listened with growing excitement. This wasn't just a talented student playing difficult music correctly. This was a young musician who understood that all music, whether composed 300 years ago or improvised 3 minutes ago, was about communication, about sharing human experiences through sound. When Rosa finished all 3 of her prepared pieces, the room fell silent again. But this time the silence felt different. It felt full of possibility rather than uncertainty. Professor Chen spoke first. Rosa, what are your plans if you don't receive this scholarship? The question caught Rosa off guard. I'm not sure. I'll probably stay in my hometown, maybe take some online classes, keep practicing on my own. And if you do receive the scholarship, what would you want to study here? Rosa thought for a moment. An hour ago, she would have said performance because that's what she thought serious musicians did. But after what had just happened, after creating something entirely new in front of these professors, she realized her answer had changed. I think I'd want to learn how to write down the music I hear in my head. I'd want to study composition so I could share my ideas with other musicians. But I'd also want to keep performing, because I love the feeling of connecting with people through music. Professor Martinez smiled. Rosa, that sounds like exactly the kind of musician we're looking for. The last notes of Rosa's prepared pieces faded into the audition room, leaving behind a silence that felt different from any silence Rosa had ever experienced. It wasn't the empty quiet of an unused room or the awkward pause of a conversation gone wrong. This silence felt full, pregnant with meaning, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Professor Chen sat perfectly still at the panel table, his pen frozen halfway through writing a note on his evaluation form. His eyes were focused on Rosa, but his expression was unreadable. Was he impressed? Disappointed? Rosa couldn't tell, and the uncertainty made her stomach twist into knots. Professor Martinez had stopped writing entirely. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was staring at the piano as if she had never seen one before. Professor Johnson was leaning back in his chair, his eyebrows raised slightly, the beginning of what might have been a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The other two professors, Dr. Williams and Professor Cohen, seemed frozen in time. Dr. Williams had been reaching for his water glass when Rosa finished playing, but his hand remained suspended in midair. Professor Cohen's mouth was slightly open, as if she had been about to say something, but the words had simply disappeared. Rosa turned on the piano bench to face the panel fully, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence continued to stretch, second by agonizing second. She began to count her heartbeats, 1, 2, 3, 4, but lost track somewhere around 15 when she realized her heart was beating so fast the numbers seemed meaningless. Had she completely misunderstood what they wanted? She had practiced those 3 pieces for months, drilling every difficult passage until she could play them in her sleep. The Bach invention had been technically flawless, she was sure of that. The jazz standard had showcased her ability to work with different musical styles. And her original composition, well, that had come straight from her heart. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe they had wanted to see her interpretation of existing masterworks, not her own musical voice. Maybe improvising for 8 minutes had been completely inappropriate for a formal audition setting. Rosa began to second-guess every choice she had made. Should she have played it safer? Stuck to the traditional audition format she had seen described online? Should she have chosen more difficult pieces to really show off her technical skills? Should she have worn something more formal? Something that would have helped her fit in with the other applicants? The silence in the room was becoming unbearable. Rosa could hear every tiny sound. The hum of the air conditioning, the distant murmur of voices from other audition rooms, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall that she hadn't noticed before. She could even hear her own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet space. She wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension. Maybe she could ask if they had any questions about her pieces. Maybe she could apologize for taking so much time with her improvisation. Maybe she could offer to play something else, something more traditional, something that would prove she really did belong in a place like Berkeley. But something kept her quiet. Maybe it was the memory of Professor Chen's kind eyes when he had asked her to respond to that single note. Maybe it was the way Professor Martinez had leaned forward with interest when Rosa had played her own composition. Maybe it was simply the feeling that this silence meant something important, and breaking it too soon would somehow diminish what had just happened. Rosa thought about her mother, probably sitting in their cheap hotel room right now, watching the clock and wondering how the audition was going. Carmen had sacrificed so much to get Rosa to Boston. Extra work shifts, borrowed money, nights without sleep worrying about travel costs. What would Rosa tell her if this audition had been a disaster? She thought about Mrs. Patterson back home, who had believed in Rosa when Rosa didn't even believe in herself. Mrs. Patterson had spent hours helping Rosa prepare, staying after school to coach her through difficult passages, encouraging her to apply for this scholarship in the first place. How could Rosa face her if she had blown this opportunity? Most of all, Rosa thought about herself. The girl who had spent years playing alone in empty rooms. The girl who had taught herself to make music despite broken piano keys and no formal training. The girl who had found the courage to step out of the shadows and claim her place at this piano. Had she just made the biggest mistake of her life? Or had she done exactly what she was supposed to do? The silence continued. Rosa began to notice that the professors weren't just quiet, they seemed almost stunned. Professor Chen's usually animated face was completely still. Professor Martinez, who had been taking detailed notes throughout Rosa's performance, hadn't written a single word since the music ended. Rosa's mind started racing through possible explanations for their reactions. Maybe what she had played was so far below their standards that they didn't know how to politely tell her the audition was over. Maybe they were wondering how she had even made it to the finalist round. Maybe they were already thinking about the next student, the one who would probably give them the kind of polished, traditional performance they were really looking for. But then Rosa remembered something Professor Chen had told her in the hallway earlier. Technical perfection is common. Real musicianship is rare. Could it be that their silence wasn't disappointment but something else entirely? She thought about the moment just before she had started improvising, when Professor Chen had asked her to respond to a single note. The request had seemed simple, but Rosa realized now that it had been anything but simple. He hadn't asked her to demonstrate a skill or show off a technique. He had asked her to be musical, to be honest, to be herself, and that's exactly what she had done. As Rosa sat in the continuing silence, she began to feel something shift inside her. The anxiety and self-doubt were still there, but underneath them was something stronger, a quiet confidence that she had done exactly what the moment had called for. She had played music that came from her heart, music that told her story, music that couldn't have been created by anyone else in the world. Whether that was what the professors wanted or not, it was what Rosa had to offer. It was who she was. The clock on the wall continued its soft ticking. The silence stretched toward what felt like forever, and Rosa sat at the piano bench waiting to discover whether being authentically herself had been enough. Professor Chen finally moved. He set down his pen completely and looked directly at Rosa. His expression was no longer unreadable. There was something there that looked almost like awe. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been all afternoon, as if he was afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow diminish what had just occurred. "Rosa," he said slowly, and then paused as if he was choosing his words very carefully. "In 25 years of teaching, I have never—" He stopped mid-sentence and shook his head slightly, as if he couldn't quite find the words he was looking for. Rosa's heart pounded as she waited for him to continue. "Never what? Never heard someone play so poorly? Never been so disappointed in a finalist? Never wanted to end an audition so quickly?" Professor Chen tried again. "I have never heard anything quite like what you just shared with us." Rosa still couldn't tell from his tone whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. She waited, hardly daring to breathe for him to explain what he meant. The other professors remained silent, but Rosa could see that they were all focused intently on this moment, as if what happened next would be very important indeed. Professor Chen stood up from the panel table and walked toward the piano where Rosa was sitting. As he approached, Rosa could see something in his eyes that she had never seen directed at her before. It looked like respect. Professor Chen stopped just a few feet from where Rosa sat at the piano bench. Up close, she could see that his eyes were bright with something that looked like excitement, though he was clearly trying to maintain his professional composure. "Rosa," he said, his voice gentle but serious, "I need to ask you something very important." Rosa nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. "That piece you just improvised, the one that grew out of the middle C I played for you. Have you ever written it down? Do you have sheet music for it?" Rosa shook her head. "No, sir. I don't really know how to write music down properly. I just play what I feel." Professor Chen turned to address the other panel members. "Professor Martinez, would you mind bringing some manuscript paper from the supply closet?" As Professor Martinez hurried out of the room, Rosa's confusion grew. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Did I do something wrong?" Professor Chen sat down on a nearby chair, bringing himself to Rosa's eye level. "Rosa, you didn't do anything wrong. In fact, you may have just done something extraordinary." Professor Johnson leaned forward from his place at the panel table. "Rosa, what you just played, that improvisation, it wasn't just a random collection of notes. It was a complete musical composition with clear themes, development, and resolution. You created a sophisticated piece of music in real time without any preparation. But more than that," added Dr. Williams, "it was deeply personal and emotionally authentic. You told a story through music that we could all understand and feel." Rosa looked around the room at the 5 professors, all of whom were now focused entirely on her. "I still don't understand why you want me to write it down." Professor Martinez returned with several sheets of blank manuscript paper and a pencil. She placed them on the piano's music stand and stepped back. Professor Chen stood up again. "Rosa, I want you to try to notate as much of that improvisation as you can remember. Don't worry about getting every single note perfect. Just capture the main themes and the overall structure. But I told you, I don't really know how to write music properly. I know the basics from music theory class, but I've never actually composed anything on paper." "That's okay," Professor Martinez said encouragingly. "We're not looking for perfect notation. We just want to see if you can capture the essence of what you played. Rosa stared at the blank staff lines on the manuscript paper. They looked impossibly empty, like they were waiting for something important that she wasn't sure she could provide. I don't know if I can remember it all, she said hesitantly. Professor Chen smiled. Just start with the opening theme, the way you developed that first middle C into a melody. See how much comes back to you. Rosa picked up the pencil and began to write tentatively. She started with a treble clef, then added the time signature. 4/4 seemed right for the way the piece had felt. Then she wrote that first middle C, the note that had started everything. As she began to add the notes that had followed, something remarkable happened. The melody came flooding back to her, as clear as if she were hearing it played in the room right now. Her hand began to move more confidently across the page, adding notes and rhythms that captured the essence of what she had created just minutes before. The professors watched in amazement as Rosa worked. She wasn't just writing down random notes. She was reconstructing a complex musical composition from memory, translating the improvised performance back into written form with remarkable accuracy. "This is incredible," Professor Martinez whispered to Professor Johnson. "She's capturing not just the melody line, but the harmonic progressions, the rhythmic variations, even some of the dynamic markings." As Rosa continued writing, she found herself getting lost in the process. It was like solving a puzzle where she already knew what the final picture was supposed to look like. Each note she added helped her remember the next one, and before long she had filled the first page of manuscript paper. "I think I need another page," she said. Looking up at the professors, Professor Chen handed her a fresh sheet. "Take your time. This is fascinating to watch." Rosa continued working, occasionally humming softly to herself as she tried to remember specific passages. Sometimes she would stop and tap out a rhythm on the piano bench, making sure she had the timing right before committing it to paper. After about 20 minutes, Rosa set down the pencil and looked at what she had created. 3 pages of handwritten music that captured the heart of her improvisation. Not every single note, but enough to allow someone else to understand and perform the piece. "I think that's most of it," she said. "Some of the details might be a little different, but the main ideas are all there." Professor Chen picked up the manuscript pages and studied them carefully. As he read through Rosa's notation, his eyebrows rose higher and higher. "Rosa, this is remarkable. You've created a complete composition with clear musical structure, sophisticated harmonic language, and genuine emotional depth, and you did it all in real time, then reconstructed it from memory." Professor Martinez took the pages next and examined them closely. "The way you've developed your themes here, the way you've used repetition and variation to create unity and interest, these are advanced compositional techniques that most students don't master until their junior or senior year." Rosa felt her cheeks burning. "It wasn't that complicated. I was just playing what felt right." "That's exactly what makes it so impressive," said Professor Johnson. "You have such strong musical instincts that you're applying sophisticated compositional principles naturally, without even realizing it." Dr. Williams stood up from the panel table and joined the group around the piano. "Rosa, in my 20 years at Berkeley, I've seen many talented students. But what you've demonstrated today is something quite rare. The ability to think musically in real time, to create original compositions spontaneously, and to remember and notate complex musical ideas." Professor Cohen, who had been quietly observing throughout the audition, finally spoke up. "Rosa, can I ask you something? When you were improvising, when you were creating this piece, what was going through your mind?" Rosa thought for a moment. "I wasn't really thinking about music theory or composition rules or anything like that. I was just responding. The single note that Professor Chen played made me feel something, and I wanted to explore that feeling through music." "And the story the music told?" Professor Cohen continued. "The emotional journey we heard, where did that come from?" Rosa's voice became softer. "I guess it came from my own journey. Growing up playing on a broken piano, learning music by myself, feeling like I didn't belong in places like this but dreaming about them anyway. The music was about taking something small, like one note, and seeing how big it could become if you weren't afraid to explore." The professors exchanged meaningful glances. Professor Chen set down the manuscript pages and looked directly at Rosa. "Rosa, I need to tell you something. This scholarship competition has been incredibly competitive this year. We've heard from over 200 initial applicants, and we invited only 30 students for live auditions. Every one of those students is exceptionally talented. Rosa's heart sank. This sounded like the beginning of a rejection speech. But, Professor Chen continued, what you've shown us today goes beyond just talent. You've demonstrated genuine musicianship, creative thinking, and the kind of artistic voice that can't be taught. It can only be discovered and nurtured. He paused and looked around at his colleagues, who all nodded in agreement. Rosa, I'm not supposed to make announcements about scholarship decisions during the audition process. The official results won't be announced until next week, but I think my colleagues and I are in agreement that we found our scholarship recipient. Rosa stared at him, not sure she had heard correctly. Are you saying... Professor Martinez smiled broadly. Rosa, we're saying that if you want it, you have a full scholarship to study music at Berkeley. Tuition, room, board, everything covered for 4 years. Rosa felt the world tilt sideways. The room seemed to spin slightly, and she gripped the edge of the piano bench to steady herself. But more than that, Professor Chen added, we'd like you to consider a dual major in performance and composition. What you've shown us today suggests you have real potential as a composer, and we'd love to help you develop that gift. Rosa opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. After a moment, tears began streaming down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness, but of joy so overwhelming she couldn't contain it. I can't believe this is real, she finally managed to say. Professor Johnson laughed warmly. It's very real, Rosa. Welcome to Berkeley. As Rosa sat at that piano bench, surrounded by professors who believed in her potential, holding the sheet music for a composition she had created from her heart, she realized that her life had just changed completely. The quiet girl from the back row was about to become a music student at one of the most prestigious institutions in the country. But more than that, she had discovered something about herself that she never knew existed. She wasn't just someone who played music. She was someone who created it, and that discovery would change everything that came next. 5 years had passed since that life-changing audition, but Rosa could still remember every detail of that day in the Berkeley audition room. Now, as Dr. Rosa Hernandez, she had kept her family name even after earning her doctorate. She stood in the familiar hallway of Lincoln High School, her diploma still feeling surreal in her hands. The school looked exactly the same faded motivational posters on the walls, the same smell of cafeteria food and floor wax, the same squeak in the door to the music room. But Rosa felt like a completely different person walking through these halls. She paused outside the music classroom where it all began. Through the small window in the door, she could see Mrs. Patterson, now grayer but still energetic, leading a group of students through a basic music theory lesson. Rosa smiled, remembering herself at that age, sitting in the back corner, absorbing every word but too afraid to speak up. Mrs. Patterson had retired 2 years earlier, but when Rosa called to ask if she could come speak to the current music students, her old teacher had immediately volunteered to come in as a guest instructor for the day. I wouldn't miss this for the world, Mrs. Patterson had said over the phone. I always knew you were destined for something special. Rosa knocked gently on the classroom door and stepped inside. The students, about 20 of them, ranging from freshmen to seniors, looked up with the kind of polite but uninterested attention that teenagers give to most adult visitors. Students, Mrs. Patterson announced with obvious pride, I'd like you to meet Dr. Rosa Hernandez. She's a graduate of our music program, and she has quite a story to share with you. Rosa walked to the front of the class and looked out at the young faces staring back at her. In the back row, she spotted a girl who reminded her strongly of herself at that age. Head down, quiet, clutching her books close to her chest. Rosa made a mental note to speak with her after the presentation. Hi, everyone, Rosa began, her voice warm and conversational. Mrs. Patterson introduced me as Dr. Hernandez, but 5 years ago, I was sitting in one of those chairs just like you. I was the girl in the back corner who never raised her hand, never volunteered for anything, and honestly thought I wasn't good enough to be in this room with all the real musicians. A few students looked up with more interest. Rosa had their attention now. I want to tell you about the day that one note changed my entire life. For the next 30 minutes, Rosa shared her story. She talked about learning piano on a broken instrument at home, about practicing in secret during lunch periods, about the audition that seemed impossible until Mrs. Patterson encouraged her to try. But most importantly, she talked about the moment when Professor Chen played that single middle C and asked her to respond. I had prepared for months, Rosa explained. I had 3 perfect pieces memorized. I was ready to show them exactly what they wanted to see. But instead of asking for my prepared pieces, Professor Chen played one note and asked me to be honest about what it meant to me. The students were completely engaged now, leaning forward in their seats. That moment taught me something crucial about music and about life. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is not give people what you think they want to hear, but share what's authentically yours to give. Rosa walked over to the piano at the front of the classroom, the same piano where she had spent so many lunch periods discovering her voice. The piece I improvised that day became my senior thesis composition at Berklee. It's now performed by youth orchestras around the country. But more importantly, it taught me that I wasn't just someone who played other people's music. I was someone who had my own musical voice, my own stories to tell. She sat down at the piano bench and placed her hands on the familiar keys. Let me play a little bit of that piece for you, the piece that started with just one note. As Rosa began to play, she was transported back to that audition room. But this time she wasn't nervous or uncertain. She was sharing a piece of herself that had grown and developed over the years, a musical story that had become richer and more nuanced through study and experience. When she finished playing, the classroom was completely silent, but it was the good kind of silence. The kind that happens when people have been moved by something beautiful. A student in the middle row raised her hand. "Dr. Hernandez, how did you know you were good enough for a school like Berklee?" Rosa smiled. "Honestly, I didn't. I spent most of that audition convinced I was making a huge mistake. But here's what I learned. You don't have to feel ready to take a big step. You just have to be willing to try." Another hand went up. "But what if you don't have money for applications and travel and all that stuff?" "That's a real challenge," Rosa acknowledged. "My mom worked 3 jobs to get me to that audition, and our whole community helped out. But here's something important. I've established a scholarship fund specifically for students who have financial barriers to pursuing music education." Mrs. Patterson beamed from her seat at the side of the room. She had helped Rosa set up that scholarship fund. Using Rosa's first royalty checks from her compositions, Rosa continued, "Every year we provide full funding for 5 students to attend summer music programs, apply to colleges, and audition for scholarships, because talent doesn't depend on your bank account." The girl in the back row, the one who reminded Rosa of herself, tentatively raised her hand. "What if you're not sure you're actually good at music? What if you just like it a lot?" Rosa walked over to where the girl was sitting. "What's your name?" "Anna," the girl replied quietly. "Anna, loving music is the most important qualification there is. Everything else can be learned. But that passion, that connection you feel to music, that's something special that can't be taught." Rosa looked around the room at all the students. "I want each of you to remember something. 5 years ago, I was convinced that music was something other people did. People with more training, more money, more confidence than I had. But music doesn't belong to other people. It belongs to anyone who feels it in their heart and has the courage to share it." After the presentation, students crowded around Rosa with questions about Berklee, about composition, about the music industry. But Rosa noticed that Anna had stayed in her seat, gathering her books slowly. Rosa approached her. "Anna, can I ask what instrument you play?" "Piano," Anna said softly. "But I'm not very good. I just practice on this old keyboard at home." Rosa's heart jumped. "Would you mind playing something for me?" Anna looked around nervously. The other students had left, but Mrs. Patterson was still there, organizing papers at her desk. "I don't really know any real pieces," Anna admitted. "That's okay," Rosa said gently. "Just play something you like. Something that means something to you." Anna walked to the piano and sat down at the bench. After a moment of hesitation, she began to play a simple melody, something she had clearly created herself, though she probably didn't think of it as composition. As Rosa listened, she felt a familiar chill run down her spine. Anna's playing had the same quality that Rosa's had possessed at that age, a natural musicality that couldn't be faked, an emotional honesty that came through in every note. When Anna finished, Rosa sat down next to her on the piano bench. "Anna, that was beautiful. Did you write that yourself?" Anna blushed. It's not really a song. I just play what I feel sometimes. Rosa and Mrs. Patterson exchanged meaningful glances across the room. Anna, Rosa said carefully, how would you feel about applying for one of those scholarships I mentioned? I think you might be exactly the kind of musician we're looking for. 6 months later, Rosa received a video in her email. It was Anna's audition tape for the Berklee Scholarship Competition, the same competition Rosa had won 5 years earlier. As Rosa watched Anna play, she saw herself in the girl's nervous but determined performance. But more than that, she saw the future. She saw how talent could be nurtured and supported, how barriers could be removed, how one student's success could create opportunities for the next generation. The video ended with Anna playing an original composition, a piece she had created in response to hearing Rosa's story. It was different from Rosa's style, uniquely Anna's own voice, but it had the same quality of authentic musical expression that had impressed the Berklee faculty all those years ago. Rosa immediately called Professor Chen, who was now the department chair at Berklee. David, she said when he answered the phone, I think I've found our next scholarship recipient. As Rosa hung up the phone, she realized that this was what success really looked like, not just achieving your own dreams, but creating paths for others to achieve theirs too. That single note that Professor Chen had played 5 years ago had created ripples that were still spreading outward, touching lives that Rosa had never imagined when she was just a scared 17-year-old sitting at a piano bench in Boston. Rosa walked to her own piano, a beautiful grand piano that she could finally afford, and played that familiar middle C. But now, instead of hearing uncertainty and possibility, she heard gratitude and hope. The note resonated through her apartment and faded into silence. But Rosa knew that somewhere a young musician was hearing their own version of that note, getting ready to discover what their musical voice had to say to the world. And the ripples would continue spreading, one note at a time, one student at a time, one dream at